What was the largest averted tragedy of all time? Stanislav Petrov refusing to launch the Soviet nukes despite the incoming US ones. This was going to be my answer. Although it is important to note that there were no incoming US nukes. It was a false alarm, and Stanislav Petrov prevented an accidental crisis. If he hadn't gone against protocol direct orders Russia would have inadvertently started a nuclear war thinking they were the ones defending themselves. A while ago, a large passenger plane almost landed on a taxiway where four full passenger planes were waiting to take off. The pilots of the first plane in the queue, noticing the incoming aircraft, turned on all the lights they had. The pilots of the landing aircraft were barely able to climb out. This would have easily been the largest aircraft disaster in history. Air Canada Flight 759, https://en.wikipedia.org/wiki/air_canada_flight_759 . There were 1,077 people on board the 5 planes that would have been hit. Not to mention what would have happened with 4 fully fuel-laden planes exploding on an active runway, terminal catching fire leading to panic, smoke inhalation, etc. Had it happened, in all likelihood would have been world-changing in the way airports and air travel functions. Humanity collectively decided that we'll just buy different hairspray and close the continent-sized hole in the ozone layer. I know it wasn't just the hairspray, savior, but actually. This was mad tbh. Scientists went, "Hey, this chemical is bad, stop using it," and the world just went, "Yeah, that sounds reasonable." These days people would be going wild with anti-ozone groups springing up. In the 1950s, FDA pharmacologist Francis Oldham Kelsey, despite heavy pressure from pharmaceutical companies, refused approval for the drug thalidomide, intended to relieve morning sickness in pregnant women, claiming the drug needed more testing. Thalidomide was approved in almost 50 other countries and was later found to be the cause of thousands of infant deformities and miscarriages. Didn't quite save everyone, but certainly a large portion of a generation in the United States. Not largest at all, but when Vincent Coleman realized the 2 military ships were going to explode in the Halifax harbor, he sacrificed his life so trains would stop and not come into Halifax when the ships would explode. And French Navy officers tried to warn people, but since the people only spoke English and the Navy only spoke French, they started grabbing people's children and running away from the harbor, knowing that people would run after kidnappers. They saved a lot of lives by their quick thinking. Hold up the train. Ammunition ship afire in harbor making for Pier 6 and will explode. Guess this will be my last message. Goodbye, boys. There's a memorial to Vince Coleman which is 2 giant brass spheres placed side by side, and the rumor is these are his actual balls *, which were the only part of him to survive the catastrophic detonation. Citation needed. We all mock Y2K now. But at the time, it was genuinely a ticking time bomb. The work of engineers and computer scientists to prevent any major issues is really unknown. My favorite tidbit from Y2K is that the Chinese government demanded that all commercial airplane executives had to be in the air at midnight to ensure they took the issue seriously. As someone who was part of a team doing Y2K upgrades for banks and shit all over town, yeah, so much this. People assume Y2K was just overblown, but without the frantic work of thousands of people for a year or more, financial networks and such would have imploded overnight. Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. My father was on an aircraft carrier in the Mediterranean during the Cuban Missile Crisis. They went dark with jets loaded with live nukes with enough fuel for a one-way trip to Moscow. He said the general public has no idea how close we came to the end of the world. The thing I hate the most about the Cuban Missile Crisis is that the lessons it taught us are intentionally misrepresented all the time. The commonly, at least when I was in school, presented outcome was that of heroic Kennedy, calling Khrushchev's bluff, and essentially getting the Soviets to back down with pure brinksmanship. In reality, the crisis was averted through frank dialogue, negotiation, trust, and ultimately both sides making concessions and backing down peacefully. It really chaps my hide when genuine instances of diplomacy triumphing over warmongering get miswritten as some kind of juvenile own of the other side, because it greatly reduces the odds of handling conflicts without bloodshed further down the line. Forever grateful to the passengers on Flight 93 who prevented the plane from being flown into another target on 9/11. The loss of the passengers remains an enormous, horrible tragedy itself, but we have no idea how many other lives were saved by their actions. Vice President Dick Cheney, in the Presidential Emergency Operations Center deep under the White House, authorized Flight 93 to be shot down, but upon learning of the crash, is reported to have said, "I think an act of heroism just took place on that plane." You're goddamn right it did. Three Gorges Dam crosses the Yangtze River in China. In the summer of 2020, the rain season was particularly heavy. Fears of shoddy construction lead to worry of it bursting and flooding everything downriver, including the cities of Wuhan and Nanjing. Millions could have died in a matter of hours. Engineers opened smaller dams to release pressure from the large one, flooding thousands of hectares of land. The dam did not burst, and it would have been a tragedy. The invention of a machine by Alan Turing to crack German encrypted messages during World War II is estimated to have shortened the war by 2 years and saved 14 million lives. He was later prosecuted for homosexual acts, chose to be chemically castrated, which severely impacted him. He then committed suicide. He is widely regarded as the father of computing and AI. I knew of his accomplishments way back in the 90s in school. It took me till seeing the movie to learn how he was treated socially because of his sexuality. I couldn't believe the ignorance of killing one of the greatest minds to have ever lived. It's asinine. Cuban Missile Crisis. It was 13 days where the fate of the world relied on leaders being diplomatic, precise, and courageous. The Soviets caving basically saved the world. Khrushchev basically committed career suicide to make it happen too. He deserves credit. It's easy to downplay the early years of the Cold War in retrospect, but at the time shit was tense. It still doesn't of course make the sting of the consequences hurt any less. The Vietnam War destroyed an entire region over unfounded paranoia. And that's just the tip of an iceberg of orchestrated coups and political unrest fueled by the same paranoia. And that cunt Kissinger. The 2018 ISIS terror attack on Mecca. Just a bit of context. Daesh, ISIS really have a problem with the practices of Hajj. As Wahhabis go, they make the Saudis look like bones of the saints. Catholics in how much they do not approve of things they believe are idolatry, including common things Muslims do on Hajj like circling the Kaaba. They see them as not merely non-canonical but idolatrous. So their plan was to blow up major sites, including the Kaaba at the height of Hajj, potentially resulting in the highest death toll during a terror attack since 9/11. Considering the crowds during Hajj, and the targets, and the severity of the attacks, the death toll would be in the thousands. The Saudi security forces foiled the plot just days before it was going to happen. https://www.theguardian.com/world/2017/jun/24/saudi-security-foils-terror-plot-targeting-mecca-grand-mosque. The Al-Qaeda terrorist who got caught trying to get into Port Angeles in 1999 at the US-Canada border. He had explosives in his car and was planning on using them at LAX on New Year's Eve 1999. That would have been awful, so glad he was caught. At such a small border crossing, this may have been missed. If I remember correctly, the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster could have been way worse. The operators stayed and did everything in their power, including ignoring an uninformed order from a government official, to mitigate the fallout. It definitely wasn't a perfect response, but I think they saved a lot of lives. There was a power plant even closer to the epicenter that shut down without incident because the engineer designing it insisted on a seawall much higher than the one that the bureaucrats wanted. He said that the plant be able to pull seawater even if a tsunami pulled the seawater away from the shore. He insisted, and that power plant not only shut down without incident but served as an emergency shelter for people from the nearby town due to how little damage it had suffered. https://www.oregonlive.com/opinion/2012/08/how_tenacity_a_yar.html. His name was Yanosuke Hirai, and my favorite quote about the man who trained him is, "Matsunaga-san hated bureaucrats," Oshima said. He said they are like human trash. In your country, too, there are probably bureaucrats or officials who never take final responsibility. So Matsunaga's attitude was that you've got to go beyond the regulations, Oshima said. If you just follow the regulations, you end up with what happened at Fukushima Daiichi. That's what Matsunaga told Hirai, and Hirai taught me. Recently rewatched Chernobyl, and holy shit. I'm glad I live in a world where they managed to prevent the shit leaking out of the destroyed core from exploding and contaminating half of Europe for the next couple of millennia. Edit. Apparently the show took a lot more creative freedom with the science than I thought it did, and the worst case scenario portrayed in the show wouldn't have happened anyway. Read the comments to this one for further information. Fortunately, this is just a line they made up for the show. What actually happened in Chernobyl was pretty damn close to the worst case scenario, and there's no reality in which half of Europe suffered notable contamination. I'm currently reading Midnight in Chernobyl, and the show does such an amazing job at conveying the impending doom. The Soviet Union just threw human bodies at the issue and fixed it with a devastating toll on the local populations. Secrecy and fear of mockery from the outside world made it even worse. The worst off in the immediate explosion were the plant engineers and the first responders who got fatal doses in minutes and even seconds from exposure. I highly recommend watching Grazed by the Apocalypse video by Lemino on YouTube. He pretty much covered the major averted tragedies that could have resulted into an apocalypse in this video. In June 2007, 2 car bombs were found and disabled in crowded parts of London. Less than 2 days later, 2 other losers tried to ram their way into Glasgow Airport with a truck that was on fire and filled with propane canisters. A few members of the public in that last case suffered minor injuries when they helped police detain the 2 losers. I can't imagine the consequences if either one of those events had succeeded. Not the largest by far, but the Reston virus outbreak in 1989 could have been really horrifying. The virus causes Ebola in non-human primates, but they didn't know this until one of the handlers cut himself when performing a necropsy on a liver of one of the infected monkeys, and was put under surveillance during the incubation period and showed no symptoms. It's so closely related to a strain that is lethal to humans, but somehow only lethal to non-human primates. Growing up in, around Reston less than a decade after this outbreak is so weird to think about. Reston is less than an hour away from Washington, D.C., with many people commuting there for work. It could have been really, really bad. There's a book about it by Richard Preston, called The Hot Zone. The 1980 Damascus Titan missile explosion. A Titan II missile in Arkansas developed a fuel leak and exploded in its silo, the force throwing its nuclear warhead away from the blast. Miraculously, the safety mechanisms prevented a nuclear detonation, saving potentially millions of lives and sparing the environment from a nuclear disaster. If it had gone off, the stratification of the Cold War's delicate balance could have taken a far more apocalyptic turn. Miraculously, the safety mechanisms. It was extremely fortunate the warhead didn't go off, but that was literally why it had multiple layers of physical and electronic safety mechanisms. It was designed, in theory, to actually experience a plane crash or a missile explosion without detonating unintentionally. Edit. But if you read Command and Control * by Eric Schlosser, which is the definitive popular book on the Damascus incident, and nuclear weapon safety engineering, it's absolutely clear how lucky we were that a nuke never went off by accident in the years before the technology matured. The Tunguska asteroid nearly wiping out the largest city on Earth in 1908. I give you an inverted one. The day Titanic was leaving port, it almost hit 2 other ships near it. If that had been the case, it would have been forced to go back and cancel the trip, saving it from that iceberg. It also would have saved those guys in the submarine. Well, not the worst, but the Halifax explosion could have been worse. When those ships collided in the harbor, A dispatcher at the railway learned what had happened and of the imminent explosion. Everyone else was trying to flee and he stayed. He stayed to send out telegraphs warning incoming trains away, knowing that by doing this, he wouldn't have time to get out. He stopped all rail traffic headed for Halifax, including one train that was mere minutes away and had at least 300 aboard. His name was Patrick Vincent Coleman and he was a fucking hero. Not the largest, but a notable one. Tilly Smith, a 10-year-old British girl who saved more than 100 people from the 2004 tsunami in Thailand because she had just studied the tsunamis in school. When the sea suddenly began to boil, then pulled away from the beach, leaving fish and boats stranded high, Tilly recognized that a tsunami was approaching. Her frantic warnings were heeded, and the beach was evacuated just moments before the waves hit the shore. Francis Oldham Kelsey, the FDA investigator charged with approving thalidomide for use as a morning sickness-related antiemetic, refused to rely solely on the manufacturer's insistence that the drug was safe for use during pregnancy. She resisted pressure to approve the drug, insisting on additional testing which definitively proved its association with severe birth defects, leading to it never being made available in the US and preventing countless deaths and disfigurements. The Bosnian conflict and the taking of Pristina airfield in 1999. The US General Wesley Clark ordered the 200 British troops to destroy and squash the Russians holding the runways. The British guy in charge refused to do so, understanding if they did, WWII would probably be all but inevitable. The US Gen took it to the British General Mike Jackson, who backed us his soldier and stated, "I'm not making my troops responsible for starting WWII." So the British troops instead surrounded the airfield without combat and cut off supplies to the Russians. 2 days later they peacefully shared the airfield. The brave guy who refused to have the nonsensical fight. Singer James Blunt. Does Dunkirk fall into this category? I think if Hitler had been able to slaughter basically the entire British army, there might have been a drastically different outcome of the war. The widespread poisoning of the entire world from leaded gasoline. Only discovered and brought to everyone's attention by a geologist named Claire Patterson looking to date the age of the Earth. Excerpt from his wiki page. In collaboration with George Tilton, Patterson developed the uranium lead dating method into lead dating. By using lead isotopic data from the Canyon Diablo meteorite, he calculated an age for the Earth of 4.55 billion years, which was a figure far more accurate than those that existed at the time, and one that has remained largely unchallenged since 1956. Patterson first encountered lead contamination in the late 1940s as a graduate student at the University of Chicago. His work on this subject led to a total re-evaluation of the growth in industrial lead concentrations in the atmosphere and the human body, and his subsequent activism was seminal in the banning of tetraethyllead in gasoline and lead solder in food cans. When ISIS took over Mosul, maintenance on the dam stopped. By the time the US was able to get back in and inspect it, it was on the verge of collapsing and could have killed over 1 million people. I recall reading back in the days of Cracked.com articles of an incident where some well-meaning industrialists had an idea for a product that would be quite helpful to farmers. Over a period of a few years they selectively bred a bacteria that would very aggressively turn decaying plant matter into ethanol. The idea being that farmers could be more efficient by collecting their corn husks, throwing them in a big tank, sprinkling this bacteria on it and some water, then later filtering it out and fueling their farm equipment using the resulting ethanol. Even better, they used a naturally occurring bacteria that's already in the root systems of plants the world over. It doesn't manage to kill those plants in most cases because its normal behavior is a bit on the sedate side. So they were just cranking up something that already existed. It worked outstandingly, far better than they'd hoped. Everything was looking up. They were a few months away from going into full production and shipping the product out worldwide. Until someone asked, "This stuff came from living plants. It won't work on them, will it?" So they set up a controlled field in a greenhouse and sprinkled a bit of their specially grown bacteria. Within days the entire field was dead. The product launch was cancelled and the greenhouse completely sterilized. But just imagine what could have been. A massively popular launch of a product, released to all the biggest and busiest farms the world over, and then suddenly a reasonable chunk of the entire planet's crops wiped out by accident all at once. Too many of these are about specific explosions or other short-term events. Sarah Josephine Baker, https://en.wikipedia.org/wiki/Sarah_Josephine_Baker. Averted decades of ongoing and compounding tragedy with her public health initiatives, primarily for poor immigrants in the U.S. She also tracked down Typhoid Mary twice. Here's a great example. Baker aided in the prevention of infant blindness, a scourge caused by gonorrhea bacteria transmitted during birth. To prevent blindness, babies were given drops of silver nitrate in their eyes. Before Baker arrived, the bottles in which the silver nitrate was kept would often become unsanitary or would contain doses that were so highly concentrated that they would do more harm than good. Baker designed and used small containers made out of antibiotic beeswax that each held a single dose of silver nitrate, so the medication would stay at a known level of concentration and could not be contaminated. She changed packaging in an innovative way, preventing blindness in babies. A remarkable woman. The Halifax explosion in 1917 was the largest man-made explosion at the time. 2 ships collided in the harbor, one containing explosives. Over 1,700 dead and 9,000 injured. An entire First Nations community was destroyed from the tsunami the blast created. A railway dispatcher prevented further disaster by messaging a train that was about to arrive that the explosion was imminent. The message prevented not only that first train but other trains too, along with stopping ships from entering and getting a head start on rescue efforts. https://en.wikipedia.org/wiki/Halifax_explosion